My name is Janay Queen Nazaire, and I am so excited to be here in this space with my good friend and colleague, Demetric Duckett. Hi, how you doing? I
Hi,
wish we were
Janay.
in
So
person.
nice. Great to see you. I wish we were together.
Soon enough. I need some Demetric energy in my life. So if this is how I can get it, I will take it
Same here.
for
I'm just
sure.
excited that we get to
Well,
have a really fun conversation today, and I hope that others will join us in the joy that we always have whenever we get to just interact. So they'll ride along with us for a little conversation.
I love it. Well, speaking of which, the conversation today that we're going to have is about closing the racial wealth gap and a little bit about why we think it exists, and what we think you and we should do to close it. Now, I will warn you that we're going to focus on Black people in particular, and it's not to the exclusion of others, but some folks need to be unapologetically focused on Black because it is part of the reason why the wealth gap exists in the first place, because of the history of our country. And so that's part of what we're centering today is Blackness. So just excited to get started. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, one of the things that we know is that Black people across every indicator end up at the bottom, even when they have a profile that assumes that, they should be enjoying better outcomes. Demetric, will be in conversations and folks say Black women are the most educated group. And I've got 3 degrees, yet we don't reap the benefits of any of those outcomes: health, wealth, wages, being invested in as one of the fastest growing, groups of entrepreneurs. Fund managers who I know aren't getting the same funds invested that they should had they had a different, racial profile or even gender profile for that matter. So they're consistently remaining at the bottom of every outcome. And so what that means for our chances of building wealth is grim, you know?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And you know a lot of the facts about it too. What stands out for you when you think of sort of wealth-oriented facts for our folk?
Yeah, so good question. So let me give you some receipts, y'all. For every $100 of white wealth, Black families have only $5.04. What we gonna do with that? While 25% of Black families have zero or negative net worth, only 10% of white families fall into that category. And if the trajectory continues, by 2053, the average net worth for all Black families will be zero. I'm not trying to be there. I think the other thing that's a bit egregious is that I'm just not trying to be here. I pray that I'm
Some
alive
days
in
I feel like I'm already
2053.
there, right? Kid in
Okay.
college. But that's a really important thing, Janae.
Yeah, no, it is. And then, Demetric, you've talked a lot about high net worth individuals. And I think that there's there's a myth about, well, there's more wealthy Black people these days. Well, even when you look at the data, and this was commissioned in a report that we did, Radical Collaboration for Black Wealth Creation, we found that through other sources that even when you're looking at those who are making bank, in the 99th wealth percentile, Black family median wealth is about 1.5 million versus over $12 million for white folks. So that gives you a sense for how wide the gap is. So Demetric, so those are just a few numbers that we know of, and there's a lot of evidence that supports this. But should we be aiming for parity with white folks, or talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I really don't think that just looking at parity alone gets you all the way there. In living cities, we say that we want everyone to be economically secure, building wealth and living abundant, dignified, and connected lives. And so, what we're really looking for is this notion of self determination and self comfort. However, one of the major metrics around it is wealth, because without wealth in our system, in our society, you really have very little self determination. Things are more determined for you. And so, the structural racism and inequalities that are woven into the fabric of our economy cause everybody to lose out. And I know you always quote someone, Janae. What is that quote you always say?
Well, Michael McAfee, he's the CEO for Policy Link. He often asks folks, what is the logical conclusion for an economy that was founded on genocide, stolen land, and human bondage. Like, think about that for a moment. So if that's the start, what do you think the end looks like? I'm not trying to be here for that end. And I believe that we actually have to recreate, we have to disrupt that, and we have to recreate a future where we can all thrive, And so that's the work that we're doing. That's the work that I know there's a movement right now that's going on, and people are saying, sign me up. And that's wonderful. But I think it's important that we understand the numbers. For my data people out there, had we closed the gaps, had we been solving this problem a long time ago, we would have gained $16 trillion in our GDP had the gaps been closed about 20 years ago. There's a beautiful Citigroup report out there, and they talk about, if inequality was solved, we would have had 16 trillion in our GDP. Folks, imagine how we might have weathered this COVID pandemic had our economy been more healthy. Imagine, we would have struggled, but we wouldn't be suffering at the rate that we are currently suffering. Think about that, Demetric. We've all had terrible, terrible loss, but some of the loss could have been prevented had we closed racial wealth gaps.
I agree with you, Janay. I often liken it to sort of a seventh grade math problem. The reality is when you map wealth onto self-determination and disparity, it's kind of clear if you're white in our culture, then you are more likely to have all of the privilege and wealth that we've referenced. So I say if there's a 225-year gap between Black and white wealth by some measures, then ask yourself the basic question. If train A left the station, however far back and is 225 years ahead and not slowing down, how fast does train B need to go to catch up? That's a real question. And so to Michael, what is the logical conclusion? Well, for us, we've come to understand that it really takes higher speed to close the gap. So we focused our research in one element of the entrepreneur ecosystem, which is the private equity venture capital space, because it's the only spot that we know that yields high wealth outcomes for those who are successful. But there's only one problem. People really don't understand how low participation sort of manifests in that world because of racist constructs. So even in the $69 trillion global asset world, only 1.3% of that money is managed by white women and people of color. And I want to be clear, I want to say white women because women of color are included in people of color. And we want to make sure that when we are running the data, we're collecting the right thing. And we love our white women. Some of my best friends are white women. And we want to make sure everyone has an equitable chance to achieve their best. And we want people to remember that when you look at things by race in this space, the reality is when Black entrepreneurs start enterprises, they can expect to access a fraction of the resources, typically around $35,000, that their white counterparts enjoy, which is over $100,000. Some studies that we've looked at suggest that Black-owned businesses spend at least $250,000 more than their white counterparts just to get a business started. So we ask ourselves, what gives?
What gives? And it makes me think about the thing you always say, which is we need some checks written, right? Like, just write us a check. You don't always have to worry about, if you don't care about me, if you care about your pocketbook, pull out your checkbook and write some checks, because our economy can benefit from all of this activity, but people are struggling too much to just catch up and be on the same playing field. So I'm just holding that check right, and you encourage us.
We want the checks, and we want it to be applied in really special ways. The reality is we're in this thing collectively today. And while we focus obviously on the components of race disparity and wealth, the reality is we're in the same boat together. And we have to ask ourselves from a US perspective, how are we monitoring what the demographic changes look like in just another generation? That is where we get what we call the new majority in our work. That first moment in modern history in the US where white citizens won't be the majority of the population anymore. However, if you got racial wealth gaps mapped onto that, you got to ask yourself, who's going to be spending what money to support our economy, which is at least 2/3 built on consumerism. And so it's going to take a little bit more clarity for people to understand how to get all of us to a better place. And we believe that by focusing on closing racial income and wealth gaps, we can help contribute to that.
Yeah. So one of the things, so we're in philanthropy. And so we have some opportunities to catalyze and create opportunities for change. The thing that I like to remind folks of, though, is is when you're looking at the systems that you want to change, don't look at those things separate and apart from who you are, because we are the people who make up the systems, right? Our actions and our interactions produce the outcomes from each of those systems. So we have to change our actions and our interactions to produce the results that we want. We have to redesign the systems. We can no longer just sort of have our head down and perpetuate the status quo behavior that we're so used to, and then just like step back and complain about it. Well, the system. No, it is not the system. We are the system. So what's the personal work you're going to do? How can you use the power you have in your role to influence changes and new actions and interactions in systems that get results for us all to thrive? And so when you, Demetric, often are out in the world, you talk about philanthropy in the way that we should even think about the system of philanthropy. It's a catalyst. It's a change agent. It can fill some gaps, but talk a little bit about when you're like, charity alone isn't enough. It's good, but it's not enough. So
I think it just really helps to wrap up what we're really suggesting here, and it really is a mind shift. We have to change a number of different dynamics in how we approach our work and impact work, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. The reality is we're not just being quote unquote good people helping the poor people or those who are disadvantaged, because I say charity alone is just service. There's a hungry child, you give them a sandwich. But philanthropy should be charity wrapped in solutions. And I think our notion of impact work has to carry that same weight. The reality is our work should lead to a systems change effort that creates more equitable outcomes for everyone, so that we eliminate the need for charity, and that we continue to remember that all people do the best they can with what they have or what they know. And so we just want to make sure people have that space.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's been good to be here with you today. I know we have to wrap. I will say that this work is not easy, but I am often exhausted, but I am also encouraged by what I'm seeing across the board. And so I guess the question we leave you all with is like, what you are doing needs to be or must be smart business. It must be smart business. It must be smart behavior so that we can all benefit from it.
Thank you, Janay, for having me here with you.
Thank you, Mr. Duckett.
Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.